Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to just say a few words just about the UK context. I think it's really timely that Alex is here to join us. I just wanted to flag up a couple of issues. One is around the political rhetoric about falling police numbers and rising levels of crime, and this constant demand for more, more police, something that we'll talk about. As Kevin has said, Inquest works around deaths in all forms of custody and detention, as well as disasters like Hillsborough and Grenfell. And I just wanted to kind of raise a couple of issues around, firstly, who is it who gets criminalised? And questions about corporate crime, and clearly that's a massive issue in the context of Grenfell and how we hold those people responsible at a criminal level. But in the context of deaths in police custody and following police contact, many of you will be aware about the death last week of a young man, Kevin Clark, a young black man who was in mental health crisis, who was restrained and died. And he is one of 6 black men to die following the use of force in the last 9 months. And I think there's some important issues here around intersectionality and the intersection of race, ethnicity, class and mental health. And also when we look at issues around stop and search, deaths in custody, as I've mentioned, the increasing criminalisation of homeless people, and examples of where we've seen real coercive and oppressive policing, many of examples which lead to death, but also the disproportionate impact that kind of policing has, in particular on black and poor communities. And I think it's important to see that in the context of austerity and increasing levels of poverty and inequality. And as we see more and more people who are getting sucked into the criminal justice system, and how that is directly linked to cuts in frontline services. So services like mental health provision, drug and alcohol services, youth services, refuges. And it was interesting to note that the College of Policing, when discussing this recently, said that 84% of calls that they get are for non-crime incidents, what are called public safety and welfare, so issues around mental health, child protection, missing persons and suicides. And you do then raise the question really about why is there a call for more police officers and not for more mental health workers or youth workers, social workers, and alternatives to policing responses to extremely vulnerable people. So I kind of raise that as a kind of starting context for Alex's discussion, and also why it is that we see policing and a policing response as a tool of first resort rather than last resort, and as if the police can deal with all social ills. So on that kind of introduction, I'll hand over to Alex, and then we can enter into some discussion.
Very good. Thanks, Deb. And thanks to everybody who set this up. I'm just thrilled to be here. As some people know, I'm on a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but for me, this is the anchor. This is the reason for coming across to the UK. I spent 3 hours today at the Police Foundation, and you'll be happy to know they've heard your concerns, they've worked it out, and everything is fine, and you can all go home now. Yes, what is remarkable is that they were interested in hearing what I had to say, and we filled a room this big with police executives, the mayor's office. So I think they see how badly American policing is broken, and they see it coming at them. And as many problems as you obviously have with policing here in the UK, it could be worse. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I got a call from a journalist not long ago, as I sometimes do. City Council was holding some hearings about policing and mental health. Prior to that, a middle-aged woman, her name was Deborah Danner, African-American woman, lived in public housing, was known to the housing authority, was known to the local police, was known in the local emergency room as someone who had a history of mental health problems. A neighbor heard noises from her apartment, called the police for a welfare check. The police forced their way into her home, forced their way into her bedroom. She had a pair of scissors. She did not want to go with them. She felt that the situation was okay. They made some effort to manage the situation. They kind of calmed her down. She put the scissors down, and then they were like, okay, now you have to come with us. She thought they were going to leave her alone. So she picked up a baseball bat, and they shot her to death in her bedroom. The NYPD goes on 250,000 such calls every year, 250,000 a year. We also know that a quarter of all people killed by the police in the United States are having a mental health crisis at the time they're killed. It's possibly more, but those are the ones we have pretty high confidence in, and this is a fairly robust percentage from year to year. So the city council's response was, well, as well-meaning liberal city council members, well, let's have some hearings and talk about how we can improve training to policing. So the reporter called me up and wanted to talk to me about some of the different training regimes for police responses, CIT training, the Memphis model, which should they be doing? Are they doing it right? And, you know, I'm starting to talk to her about the different models and what the research shows, and I kind of stopped myself and I said, you know, I'm not really interested in fine-tuning the police response to these situations. I'm interested in ending it. And to her credit, that was a quote that she put in the daily newspaper, and not what the city council wanted to hear, because the way the city council operates is within this liberal reform framework that says that these problems can be fixed through technocratic professionalization measures that will help the police better adhere to professional, legally driven responses, and that if we just tighten things up a little bit, we'll have fewer problems. But one of the things we know about the training is that even in the best circumstances, the improvements only occur when there's actually a robust mental health infrastructure for the police to rely upon, so that they don't have to either arrest people, force them into an emergency room that'll just release them shortly thereafter, or do nothing, which is the typical response. Because what tools do the police have to resolve a mental health crisis? Handcuffs, handguns, tasers. There's a great reform. The officer that killed Deborah Danner had a taser. He didn't use it. He'd had some special training. Didn't matter. So the point of my book has been to try to get people to see the limitations of a liberal reform narrative for dealing with the very real problems of policing, to see that the precept upon which these reforms are developed is deeply problematic and is not going to provide the much needed relief that these communities are looking for. These reforms are primarily procedural in quality and technocratic. We have this big discourse about procedural justice based on research that shows that when police take the time to talk to people, explain the enforcement action, hear the other person's side of the story, that people feel better about the interaction, even if they get a ticket or get arrested. And that's pretty robustly demonstrated in the literature. It's been tested in court-based settings. Results are the same. The problem is that it says nothing about the substantive issues and outcomes of policing. A totally procedurally proper, professionally executed, unbiased, low-level drug arrest can still ruin someone's life for no damn good reason. It is fundamentally unjust, and doing it in a nicer, more professional way is not going to fix that. Got this terrible problem with school policing. Now, we've seen these school shooting incidents, which has kind of ramped up the profile of the issue. In New York, we have more NYPD personnel in schools than we have counselors of all varieties, guidance counselors, mental health counselors, college counselors, over 5,000, paid for out of the school budget. The whole idea of school policing emerged in the 1990s. There has been some precursors which are also very problematic, and I talk about it in the book. But the big onslaught comes in the 1990s and is based on totally spurious, politically motivated research, fear-mongering and political opportunism, and the privatization of public education. So the first problem was the development of the so-called super predator myth, created by a deeply conservative, politically motivated criminologist, John DiIulio, who basically cooked up some demographic data that was not accurate, borrowed bits and pieces of like offending frequency data and misrepresented it, and claimed that we were on the precipice of a wave of sociopathic juvenile violence. He did this because there had been a few really horrible, high-profile incidents in a couple of different cities, and he was interested in ginning up a kind of backlash against basically young people of color, and further undermining the social welfare system, and blaming black families for how they were raising their kids, and the solution was going to be mass incarceration. Every single year since he predicted this onslaught of sociopathic violence, juvenile violence has fallen in the United States. It's completely made it up. But the media and politicians ate it up, because it helped solve a set of political problems for them about how to mobilize race without seeming to be overtly racist. Money started flowing in to school policing from the federal government, from local and state governments. Then overlaid on top of that, at about the same time, was the Columbine school shooting, which of course created a lot of public panic about safety of children in schools. But the reality is that then and now, schools are the safest place that young people spend time. They're safer there than in their homes, than in the community, than in a workplace. And juvenile crime rates in schools are actually quite low, and kids are actually quite safe. Furthermore, there were armed police at Columbine that day, and it made no difference. There were armed police at the school in Florida last month. It made no difference. But this is not about research-driven approaches. This is not about rational considerations. This is about politics. So today, and then the third factor is the underfunding and privatization of public education through quantitative measures of high-stakes testing that have whittled down the curriculum to rote memorization, getting rid of all the extracurricular activities, and laying on top of that a whole series of zero-tolerance disciplinary policies. So kids are bored in school, are not engaged, so they act out, then they get suspended, arrested, kicked out of school, and schools benefit from that because then their test scores go up. And in the worst offenders are often these privatized charter schools who get financial incentives based on their test scores Well, we discovered at one of the charter school networks in New York, the Success Academy, they had a got-to-go list of students who they felt were dragging down their test scores, who they hounded out of their schools so that they could claim that they were disciplinary problems, not examples of educational failure. Their test scores go up, their executives can get higher paychecks, etc. Now they want to introduce more guns into the schools. They want more armed police officers. They want to arm the teachers. Well, just this week, an armed teacher accidentally discharged his weapon in a school in California, shot 3 students with bullet fragments. The very same day, an armed school resource officer in Virginia fired his weapon accidentally in a middle school. Fortunately, no one was hit. But one of the things we know is when we put more guns in a situation, we're going to have more accidental shootings, we're going to have more suicides by gun, we're going to have more interpersonal disputes turn into shootings. And there's absolutely no reason to think that this will make kids safer. Just the opposite. In fact, leading the call against putting more guns in schools have actually been some military veterans who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, who've been in firefights, who say this is insanity. Even well-trained military personnel shoot the wrong people, fail to perform under pressure, have trouble identifying who the target is. And now we're going to have a situation where we have an armed assailant with armed teachers chasing them around, and then the SWAT team arrives, and how are they supposed to know who's a teacher and who's the armed assailant? There's going to be some really horrible outcomes as a result of this. But the state of Florida just authorized arming teachers in classrooms. So the punitive mindset rolls along. What do the reformers say? Well, we need the police to get better training so that we don't have so many accidental shootings. And we need them to be nicer. And we need the students to be nicer to the school officers. The head of the school officers group in New York actually said this the other day under pressure from the city council. He's like, the problem is not us, it's the students. They don't treat us with respect. They're not nice to us, so we can't build relationships with them. We want to be their mentors. Imagine a student has a drug-related problem. They're going to go to a sworn law enforcement officer and start talking about their drug problem. Maybe they are concerned that one of their friends might be thinking about doing something violent. They're going to go tell a law enforcement officer that so that their friend can get arrested and called a terrorist? This happens in the US now. Of course, it doesn't work. We don't need school officers to be nicer. We do not need them to be better trained. We do not need them to be mentors to our children. We need no school police. It's a horrible idea. There is no evidence to support it. What we know is it's driven by a toxic politics about race and educational privatization, and it does not need to be reformed. It needs to be eliminated. And that's the basic premise of the book, is that there's been this dramatic expansion in the police role, especially over the last 40 years, that is tied to, in a lot of ways, the neoliberal austerity, structural adjustment, restructuring of our economy. The problems of our modern society have changed, and policing has adjusted to deal with them. Because policing is the coercive arm of the state that's there to manage the consequences of regimes of exploitation and domination. In the second chapter of the book, I give a history of the formation of police departments around the world. We have this liberal narrative that says that the police are here to enforce the rule of law, and the rule of law is here to benefit all of us. The Lib Dems were just saying that this weekend, right? We need more police because the rule of law will benefit everyone, especially poor people who are particularly victimized by crime, which of course they are. But this, of course, completely misunderstands the nature of the rule of law and who it actually benefits. There's a wonderful 19th century saying that the law in its majesty prevents both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, begging for bread, stealing food. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things. The neutral enforcement of the law, by its very nature, reproduces inequality because these legal frameworks are not designed to be producers of equality. And in fact, policing is directly tied, the formation of modern policing is directly tied to three primary forms of exploitation that were at the center of the Western economy in the 19th century. Now we hear in the UK a lot of talk about the police were created to manage the industrial workforce, the production of it. Yes, that's part of it. But it leaves out the role of colonialism. In the US, we hear a lot about policing as an extension of slave patrols, and that's true. But it leaves out colonialism, it leaves out in the management of industrialization. We have to understand that these things are linked. And they're not just linked rhetorically, they are linked historically in the concrete processes of the formation of police. Liberals will say, look, the London Metropolitan Police, the beginning of policing, civilian, professional policing, bringing the rule of law as an alternative to using soldiers to manage social disorder and crime or private actors. Isn't this fantastic? This is progress. But what never gets mentioned in any textbook, in any standard criminology course is, where did this idea come from? Peel didn't just make it up out of nowhere. What was his job before he came up with this idea? He was in charge of the English occupation of Ireland. He was directly involved in the formation of colonial mechanisms of policing to suppress agricultural uprisings. This is occurring in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, when the military is unavailable, the country is broke, there are uprisings occurring in Ireland, and he needs a way to manage them without the military. So he creates the Irish Peace Preservation Force. That's a little bit like a gendarmerie. It's a rural, semi-military, semi-civilian force. It's not entirely modern policing, but it signals all the functional purposes, which is that it's embedded in local communities, it's tied to law enforcement, and its primary purpose is the less violent, less aggressive, intelligence-led suppression of outrages in the countryside. They take proactive steps to identify troublemakers, head things off, and when necessary, use force to suppress uprisings. And he just takes that and brings it to London. In the US, we had our own colonial police force, the Texas Rangers, who were involved in the extermination of the native population in what is today Texas and some surrounding areas. They were involved in forcibly removing Spanish and then Mexican landowners to make way for white colonization. And up until the 1960s, they oversaw a system of Juan Crow that denied Latinos the right to vote, the right to use public facilities, the right to a public education, much like Jim Crow. In rural parts of Texas, there were separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, just like we see in Alabama and Mississippi in the same time period. They suppressed farm workers' movements. They denied people the right to vote. The first state police force in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, created in 1905. There were a wave of strikes in the late 19th century in the iron fields and coal fields, and local police were either unable or unwilling to suppress the strikes. The mines tried using private guards. That was too expensive and awkward. So the first solution was for the Pennsylvania state government to create the Coal and Iron Police, which was basically the mines would pay the state $1 a head to hire their own private police, but they were given state arrest powers and overseen by the Pinkertons and other strikebreakers. But even that was too expensive and illegitimate. So they created a state police force that could be mobilized at the state level, wasn't accountable to the local mining towns. The model for what that should look like was taken from the U.S. occupation of the Philippines in the wake of the Spanish-American War. There was a direct transfer of personnel, management techniques, and technology from the U.S. occupation forces in the Philippines to the Pennsylvania State Police. The melding of colonialism, worker suppression. In the U.S. South, many people have heard about slave patrols. We think of these rural posses stopping people on the roads, riding into plantations. And that was a major factor in the development of rural policing in the South. But actually, urban policing in the South developed slightly differently and in a way that will make the connection to modern policing much clearer, which is that in the larger southern cities, places like Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, slaves worked outside of the home of their owners, in warehouses, on wharves, in workshops. They earned wages that were paid to their owners. But for this system to operate, the slaves had to have mobility around the city. And in some cases, there were more slaves at rush hour than there were whites as they moved around the city as the industrial workforce of the New South. And whites, while benefiting financially from these arrangements, were terrified of uprisings. And they were right to be afraid of this. Blacks were secretly forming study groups, learning to read, forming religious associations, not to mention speakeasies and places of entertainment, etc. They needed a force to manage this mobile slave population. So by the 1790s, Charleston has the Charleston Watch and City Guard that's uniformed, professional, full-time, connected to legal systems, but whose primary purpose is the management of a mobile slave population. And that is the early stages of what becomes the Charleston Police. So when liberals say that the solution to policing is a little better training, some procedural reforms, they're assuming that the problem of policing is one of reestablishing police legitimacy, better articulating police to the rule of law, when in fact, the neutral application of the law is producing racialized inequality. So we have to quit trying to reform the police. It is a broken approach. It's not going to work. First of all, they're not going to do it. To the extent that they do it, it's not going to make any difference. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples, which is implicit bias training, which is very much in the conversation here in the UK, because it's wonderful for liberal politicians and reformist police executives because it's a way of addressing the problems of race in a way where no one is at fault and no one has to actually change what they do. And the whole premise behind implicit bias training is total bull. It's based on these laboratory tests in which people look at a monitor and are flashed images of people of different races, and they have these little buttons to push, and they make these little microsecond reaction time differences, and they find in the aggregate that there is a slight bias measured in microseconds for lighter skinned faces than darker skinned ones in these different situations. And the aggregate results do show up pretty consistently. The problem is, and there are many, it's completely unreproducible at the individual level. Every time they tell someone to retake the test, they get a different outcome. But there's a bigger problem. They've never once been able to show that these micro differences in response times in a laboratory setting have any impact on actual behavior. They've tried laboratory-based tests, real-world tests related to hiring, to police behavior, to educational settings. No results. They have absolutely no evidence that this has any impact on behavior, these aggregate results. They also have absolutely no evidence that the training that they are giving officers makes any difference at all in officer behavior. Which is not surprising, because the problems of race and policing are not ones of unintentional, unconscious, individual level bias. First of all, there's plenty of explicit bias. When we look for racism in policing, we find it. But that's hardly the whole story. In the US, we have police that actually look a lot like the population. A little over 12% of the population is black in the United States, and 10% of police officers are black. The US is 72% white, and about 75% of police officers are white. And we have cities like Washington, D.C., and Detroit, and Baltimore, where a majority of officers are non-white. And no one's claiming that those places have great policing, because they don't. I mean, we had rioting in Baltimore. The problems of policing and race are built into the system. They're not an accident, they're not a misunderstanding, they're not a result of bad behavior by individual officers, though all those things do exist. The missions that we've given the police are driven by a deeply rancid politics around race. Now, the most obvious is the war on drugs. I'm sure many of you have looked at Michelle Alexander's writings on this subject. We don't want to reduce this whole problem to the war on drugs, because that's also a mistake. But what she has to say about this is, I think, entirely accurate and helpful. The war on drugs has never been A, about drugs, B, about public safety, or C, about public health. We've had a war on drugs in the United States for 40 years, and drugs are cheaper, easier to get, of higher quality than they've ever been. We have record OD rates. Any high school kid in the country can get any kind of drugs they want. I teach at Brooklyn College. My students are like the best of the public high school students. They're the 10% who kept it together, who stayed in school, who stayed off the playgrounds, who didn't get into trouble. And I asked them, if your grade in this class depended upon whether or not you could have illegal drugs next week in class, is there anyone here who would be at risk of failing? And they all laugh, of course. Every once in a while, someone's hand kind of goes up, and I say, really? You don't know who you would call to get the ball rolling on that? And they're like, oh yeah, I know who I would call. And that same person can get you a gun and access to other problematic things. So this idea that the war on drugs has something to do with making us safer is just nonsense. They have absolutely no evidence to point to, because it was never about that. It was about creating a racialized conversation about law and disorder. And we have now documents from the Nixon White House, from his own staff, pointing out that they knew exactly what they were doing, that this was about expanding federal law enforcement in a way that would allow them to target African Americans, student radicals, and it would also allow them to frame these problems as problems of individual and group moral failure. And this is crucial. And this runs throughout the problems of policing. It's essential ideologically for the proponents of criminalization and policing to define our social problems of ones of individual and group moral failing. Because if that's the problem, then the solution is punitiveness. We have to wag our fingers at them and draw a line. In the best case, they need tough love. Because if they were to acknowledge that these problems are the result of market failures, of the reorganization of the economy, the production of mass homelessness, long-term joblessness, then we'd have to do something about the way the markets are organized. And that is not allowed. We have a broad, bipartisan, we say in the US, perhaps tripartisan here, consensus that neoliberal restructuring is here to stay, that the state's going to have to adjust to fewer resources, and that when problems emerge, they must be dealt with punitively. Or, in the very best case, this kind of tough love approach. And we've had some really great research in the last several years in the US about the various treatment regimes and helping regimes, things like drug courts and John schools and mental health courts and drug treatment facilities. But when we look carefully at the services that are being offered, they're primarily about reproducing a discourse of individual level responsibility and moral failure. It's a lot of pep talks about, I can do better, which fits perfectly with the whole neoliberal model. The reason you don't have enough money is because you're just not entrepreneurial enough. So could you please get your act together? These things are connected. There's not going to be a technocratic fix to policing. The whole mindset, the whole project is embedded in these systems of domination and exploitation, and we're going to have to take that on, and we're going to have to quit calling for community policing, training, and body cameras, because that is just a road to nowhere. Thankfully, this is happening increasingly. Across the United States, people are getting it. And not because they read my book. I mean, they're getting it because they've tried to get police accountability, they've tried to get reform, and they see it's a dead end. I was invited to come to Ferguson, Missouri the other day to meet with them. They had read my book by the time I got there, but the reason they asked me to come was because they had spent 4 years every day going to meetings, working with the Department of Justice, pressuring the local police, and they're like, we got nothing for this. So I said to them, we got to go the other way. Instead of asking the police to change what they do, we've got to go around them. We've got to take problems in the community and demand that government work with us to solve those problems in non-punitive ways. They got a drug problem there. The police are not part of the solution. They're going to do community organizing to talk about harm reduction and drug treatment access, real drug treatment access that would actually save lives and make people better off. And that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to not really be just a police accountability movement. We've got to be a racial and economic justice movement. And in every chapter of the book, after describing the horrors of policing, I lay out programs, positive programs, for what we should be doing instead of policing to produce community safety and increased justice, because policing is not going to give us either of those. So I'll stop there and take some questions. Thank you.
Okay, it's over to you on the floor. I'm sure there are loads of questions. I've got a few, but I'll hold those and see if anybody asks them. So, somebody want to start?
My name's Mohammed. Thank you very much for the talk. So over here, even the most, this country, even the most left-wing, prominent left-wing politician, which is Jeremy Corbyn, and I would say, I know in the United States they refer to people as being left-wing or actually just liberal. In Jeremy Corbyn's case, he is actually of the left. But even for him, for whatever reason, political or ideological, the problem is also, it's not necessarily the institutions themselves, it's the policies, and if we, once we get into power, the idea still reflects a liberal narrative, which is the state is a neutral template, and all of its institutions are inherently neutral, and what you really need is the right government in power, which will then put down the ideology and the policies that will then be implemented. So my question to you is, why does it seem to be so difficult, not for liberals, but even for those on the left, to understand that, as you described, these institutions aren't neutral, they evolved and were developed within very specific historical and economic conditions, namely that of capitalism, and they exist to perpetuate, maintain the capitalist order, not to revolutionize it.
Well, let me say this is not unique to capitalism. I mean, policing in the Soviet Union was also brutal, repressive, and unaccountable, and was also tied to exploitation and domination. So it's a slightly more universal problem, I would argue. So Corbyn, yeah. What's so progressive about hiring more police? That's actually the title of an article I wrote in New York when a group of African American and Latino city council members, who all claimed to be very progressive, their #1 budget priority was to hire 1,000 more police. They were so successful we got 1,300 more police. Yeah, the liberal narrative, even on the left, has become so hegemonic that we cannot have the things we need to make our communities safer. We can only have police. And the political leaders are not going to save us. We have got to force them to reorient their thinking. So I did not write this book for police. I did not write this book for politicians. I wrote it for you and for campaigners and for community-based folks, and I will always choose, a chance to speak in that context rather than go and give another academic talk, because we've got to change the politics on the ground. For 40 years in the US and here, Thatcherism, people have been told the only thing they can have to make their community safer is more police. People tried asking for other things. We'd like better schools, we'd like youth job schemes, we'd like better community-based mental health care systems, we'd like drug treatment for our young. You can't have those things. What you can have is more police. And so we've got a lot of work to do to reintroduce the idea that you could actually have other things. And a lot of them we know would be much better.
I think that also translates to the current debate about prisons here, building more prisons, having more police officers, prison officers, rather than thinking about decarceration and investing those resources elsewhere.
And he wants more border police, and he wants, yeah.
Next question. Woman at the back there.
Hi, I'm Blessing. Thank you for your talk and all the information you shared. I'm speaking from a position of, I've written a bit about discriminatory police practices and stop and search, and I recently was just writing about proposals for new immigration enforcement measures that would create the offence. I read a report by Stopwatch and Liberty about basically creating offensive driving whilst being a legal immigrant. And the centrality of my article and my argument there is that we still have an institutional racism problem. And as somebody who's grown up in Britain, I've had all sorts of experiences from being, I'm sure we've all heard recently about things that happened at the university in Nottingham-Trent and what just happened to the young kid in Bath. And I've seen that side, that racist element within our societies. And something I find slightly humorous is that it seems to be quite lazily assumed that racism has somehow gone away, by the fact that we all know what the word racism is, that's no longer a problem now. And that's partially why I think these ridiculous things like implicit bias training, it's kind of hiding from, like you say, the fact that people are racist. Racism still existed. This country was founded on a system of racial oppression. That's how we ended up with our economy. And as somebody who wants to, I don't just want to work as a legal advocate, I also want to work, working within community to push this message. But one thing I find extremely frustrating is when you try and confront people with the truth that racism is a thing, it still exists, and it happens every day. I don't know whether it's particular to Britain, but people get upset.
Yeah.
Like tears. And I've had conversations with friends with actual tears in their eyes because I'm explaining to them that racism is alive and well. So as much as we're doing work, because I'm sure everybody in this room is of the same mindset, right? So what would you suggest when we're trying to take this message outside the people who obviously have grips on reality and facts, when we're going out to deal with the real world and everyone else out there? How do we do this? Because short of throwing hard objects at people, I'm really lost at what to do.
So, yeah, the myth of colorblindness was very powerful in the U.S. during the Obama administration. It was very hard to talk about race, and he certainly didn't help having frank conversations about race. Ironically, Trump has kind of put that to rest in the U.S. context. No one is claiming colorblindness anymore in the U.S. So,
At least we're quite frank about it now.
Yes. Now, but your bigger point is that doesn't mean that people want to talk about it interpersonally, because they don't. People on one side want to call the other side racist, and the other side wants to say they're not, or that they are, and thank goodness, or whatever. So it still leaves the question about how do we build the necessary cross-racial alliances to make these kinds of things possible. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and give you the 5-point plan and then you just go out and do it. What I will say is that we do need to find ways to work together on this stuff, and it needs to be around a positive program. And we need to try to figure out, where the convergences are, so that creating community-based mental health systems is not an explicitly racial justice program, but it is. Because who gets killed in police custody after they've had a mental health crisis? There are some whites. I met the mother of one in Manchester the other night, obviously, but we know how disproportionate these things are. So that is the question. We've had this high school mobilization in the U.S. of students who are upset about the school shooting. They're mostly white suburban students, and we're waiting to see if their analysis will expand, if they're going to reach across to African American students who have slightly different school violence and school policing concerns. We don't know. We're hopeful, but the jury's still out on that. But that's what we're going to have to do. Yeah.
Julian Constable from Cambridge. I was just interested to hear you say that we don't really hear this argument that the state police originate in colonial practices and that kind of thing. Well, that kind of argument probably does exist in British criminology. The police are, as an organ of the state, going to be repressive. Yet, despite that, there still exists an argument for the police as a rather specialised, much smaller organisation involved in sort of maintaining order, from which we might all benefit. So I wondered what you thought might be the role, the end of policing. If there is going to be some police left, what might you think they would do, and what would they be for?
Yeah, so I think it's an empirical question. My approach to this is show me a problem. Let's put everything on the table to try to figure out how to address it. And let's do that with some principles, that we should try to treat people with dignity as much as possible, that we should do things that are cost effective, that work. When we do that, policing doesn't come out very well on the list for a huge amount of what they do today. But if at the end of the day, we've got, people with guns trying to engage in real human trafficking, or we've got people robbing banks, well, yeah, in a complex society, the state's going to need some coercive institutions. Would they look like what policing looks today? I don't know. I'm open in both directions, but in the 25 plus years that I've spent doing this, that's not really what police do. It's such a tiny fraction of what they do. For most people, if you don't know, a police officer makes a felony arrest, so talking about a regular constable, patrol officer, as we would call it, maybe once a year. If a police officer catches a real violent criminal in the act, they're like cop of the month, they're in the newspaper. That's not what police actually do. So let's deal with the vast majority of stuff that they actually do that we know is problematic, that we know there are alternatives for, and then let's see where we're at.
Kevin? You are.
One of the, I've read and reviewed your book. One of the issues that you touch upon is an issue which is very much at the forefront of people's minds in London, which is homelessness. I live in a borough in East London where 1 in 25 people is classified as homeless. And many people will have seen the news about the people sleeping on the streets around Westfield and Stratford and shopping centres, and that's repeated across London. What the response to that has been from the police has been to move people on.
Yeah.
So Section 35 powers to use to disperse people. What it does is it creates a situation where people who are already at the most vulnerable are pushed further away from places where they may be safe and further away from the potential support that may be there, including, it has to be said, threatening arrest of people who are handing out soup and handing out sleeping bags, which is something that I've seen myself. In those circumstances, I mean, we know what the solution to homelessness is. We build more houses. But the solution isn't to give powers to the police in order to be able to disperse people and make them more vulnerable. One of the campaigns that Netball runs is to install the repeal of that particular piece of legislation. It doesn't really lead to a question, but it is more of a fact that in so many other areas, you look at the powers that are available there and you say, this is not helping. We need to get rid of those powers and we need to think about things that are going to help. And in the case of homelessness, it is thinking about getting people off the streets into shelters which are genuinely safe. We are not expected to get a meal in exchange for a prayer, where and ultimately you're trying to get people into long-term accommodation. That's just logical. It's obvious, but it's not happening.
That's because it would require direct state intervention in housing markets. And they don't want to do that. Just the opposite, right? We've seen the wholesale privatization of council housing throughout the UK, moving in exactly the opposite direction. Yeah, we know housing first and other kinds of schemes could be incredibly successful, even in dealing with folks who have substance abuse issues, mental health, challenges, etc. Put them in housing, provide them some support services. They're certainly not going to get better while they're still homeless and then put them on some list. Yeah, when you get better, we'll put you in transitional housing. That's not going to work. It's because it's not designed to work, because they don't have any housing at the end of the transition period. They want people to fail out of these programs. That's why they create all these crazy restrictions and stuff. Forrest Stewart's book, Down and Out in Los Angeles, excellent explanation of how this process works in Los Angeles. This is how I got into this work, actually, over 25 years ago, getting arrested for giving out soup, actually, on more than one occasion, as it happens. Working on housing policy, that's what my training was in. I was working at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness doing economic development, housing policy, which is what I'd gone to school for, when everyone we were working with was getting arrested and harassed. And my boss was like, you've been arrested. You go figure out what's going on out there. And it turned out that was the early stages of broken windows policing, which is at the core of everything we're talking about here. The toxic ideology that shifts responsibility of disorder from market failures to individual moral inadequacies that can only be addressed through punitive enforcement action.
Can I just also just flag up, in response to what Kevin said, the role of some charities in the kind of policing of homelessness, and particularly people who are maybe undocumented and working with the Home Office, and then people ending up in immigration detention centres. And there's one charity, St Mungo's in particular, which was recently outed in the media for their conduct, which I think is, how some charities can get co-opted.
Yeah, the border is everywhere now.
Sarah, you?
Thanks. I just wanted to say first how glad I am that this conversation is happening and that you've written the book, and that we can move away from the conversations about reform and actually talk about alternatives to policing.
Thank you.
But I wanted to kind of push a little bit on something you started with, which was it could be worse. And this came up actually last week. Patrice Kalour's co-founder of Black Lives Matter was speaking here in London, and someone raised a similar issue around anti-Black racism being more subtle in the UK and not as bad as it was in the US. And she responded brilliantly by really challenging this notion of using the US as the comparator, or even not making the kind of global links around, anti-Black racism is a global phenomenon. Likewise, the problems of policing are a global phenomenon. And so, because I think it can always be worse, right? And we need to focus on how it can be better. And I guess that links to a strategic question that I have around the non-reformist reforms piece. So I've only read part of your book, so forgive me if you address this later, I haven't come to it yet. But there are places in your book where I think you compare places of policing like the UK in a more generous, I think, light than they might deserve to be described. And I see why that's a strategic thing to do if you're trying to do harm reduction. Like, how can we have less harm of the police on the way to getting rid of police? But I guess I'm interested from both of you how you make those criteria distinctions between the non-reformist reforms that actually move us away versus the ones that end up just transformation through preservation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously I don't want to overstate it could be worse. I mean, there are some metrics we could talk about. I don't feel the need to do that. I understand there are severe problems here, and that just like in the US, there's a tremendous effort to paper over them by officials. And you're quite right to point out the risks of holding up examples that may be imperfect. And interestingly, I was called out on this by police in the UK in a productive way. And in fact, I did an event last night at Canterbury College with some police officers and trainers around, and we talked a lot about the mental health picture, and it's not nearly as good in practice as it should be on paper. And in fact, many police feel very aggrieved about the whole thing because they don't want to be doing it and they see the bad outcomes. So as to the strategic question, primarily what I've tried to do is mobilize examples of positive alternatives. I think there's a way that there's some utility in saying there's such an insular thinking in the U.S., right? A parochial thinking about this. It's not even just the U.S. It's each city understands policing as an entirely disconnected thing. It's their city. Every city in the U.S. has enjoyed a crime decline over the last 25 years, and every city's local police department says it's entirely their doing. And the local media just repeat it word for word with no critical commentary at all. Oh yeah, crime is down here. The police say they're responsible. It's just completely myopic. So what I've tried to do a couple of times rhetorically is decenter that a little bit by saying, this is not the only possible way it could be. Policing, even policing with problems, could be radically different in some ways, not automatically better, but just there is another world out there. Because we're caught up in this TINA stuff. There's only one way, there's no alternative, there's only one way. So yes, you're right to raise a cautionary flag there, and I try to fine-tune that over time.
Yeah, you've spoken today about the relationship with policing in the UK and in the US, and the Black Lives Matter and the racism issues. But what do you think creates this massive blind spot to what's going on to the Aboriginal community in Australia? Because you've got that same thing of, in 1788, you've got settlement invader, colonialists, and they're far more overt about their racism, and United Nations are cautioning them on a yearly basis, but there's nothing in the dialogue from people like yourselves. And why do you think that blind spot has been created?
Well, I'm afraid I can't really comment on the Australian system per se. I can just say in the American context, we were a settler colonial society based on the extermination of an indigenous population and the enslavement of an African population that was brought over for forced labor. And we never talk about any of that in the United States. There are no monuments, there are barely any museums. There are now some efforts underway, Brian Stevenson and doing some tremendous work about getting people to acknowledge this history, documenting every lynching and putting a marker up there. This seems so basic and yet has never been done. There's no public conversation about these things, even in the Obama administration. So why would Australia be any different? The situation is, they do not have slavery, but...
You have an awareness of the black deaths in custody that are happening in the UK. And the UK have an movement here, have an awareness of what's happening in America. But there is no awareness in Australia, and it comes all from the same root. So I'm just wondering what it is that creates... Again, I don't know specifically about Australia, but I think whites have benefited from these systems of exploitation, and they don't want to take responsibility for the advantages that they enjoy today, things like transferable family wealth and other kinds of, intergenerational access to higher education and whatever. And not to mention the continual ongoing discrimination and the reliance on the criminal justice system to solve all our community problems. So, yeah, I'm afraid I can't give you anything a little more detailed than that. Maybe you can...
There are good, colleagues and Inquis have got good relationships with organisations working around deaths in custody in both Brazil and in Australia, and particularly around Aboriginal deaths, which are, the killings of Aboriginal people are extreme, both in terms of the hands of the police, but also in terms of the deaths within prison, particularly within prisons, either as a result of violence or neglect. And I was out with some Brazilian colleagues last night because we've been doing some work around police killings in the favelas, and some of you will have seen that last night a young black woman was assassinated. She'd been a really outspoken critic of police violence, particularly around some young deaths in one of the neighbouring favelas to her, and she was basically assassinated. And colleagues are trying to find out now, first of all, who was responsible. Most likely to be people at the military police, but then also the questions will be about whether or not it will be investigated or taken seriously.
There is a good tradition of police research in Australia,
Yeah.
on its historical roots and on the issues to do with police training, police culture, specifically around those kinds of issues. It's quite, it finds its way into British criminology, perhaps not so much into elsewhere, but it does exist.
Blessing, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I was going to say in response to what you were saying, is that there has been, I think what a lot of us do look for is we find, why is there not international state-to-state condemnation of this issue? And it's because since, slavery and colonialism was not isolated, it was a cooperative network between Western states. And I think when we look at examples of Australia, we wonder why is there a blind spot. Well, if you look down at what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere right now, Australia and South Africa, there is cooperation between the two in terms of giving specialist visas to white South African farmers. And that's what we have to understand, is that this is not a situation where Britain doesn't know what's going on in the US doesn't know what's going on in Britain. It's a system where there is not a single major Western state that does not somehow profit from exploitation of ethnic minorities, that does not somehow profit from the very issues we're sitting here discussing today. And that also works internationally, it works cooperatively. So I would say as much as we have this battle within our communities, it's true, we also do need to be having conversations about why is it that we will happily condemn anything that has to do with our economic interests, anything that has to do with our trade interests, anything that has directly to do with how much money we are getting, but anything to do with the deaths of vulnerable, marginalized individuals within communities that actually works in a global framework of oppression that has existed for centuries, it's silent. You can hear a pin drop. And that's something that I find quite aggravating, because it's this almost ignorance and this innocence of, oh, we have no idea, yet the British government was supporting the National Party in South Africa. We know that, it's documented, it's facts. And so that's what I also feel extremely passionate about, is because we shouldn't be empty voices screaming into, we're not voices screaming to an abyss, where people have potentially put on noise cancelling headphones and blindfolded their eyes, and they're just pretending that, oh, we have no idea what, there's racism in other countries. And that's what I want to see. I want to see international cooperation. I actually want to see, if you pardon my French, I know I'm not going to say that when I'm like him. I'm going to say that we need to stop being so childish and naive, and that goes both as if you're going to have with the full force of your chest, we've got our defense minister telling Russia to go shut up and go away. I want to see that same force and strength in your chest and talking to Australia, talking to the United States, talking to Brazil, talking to internationally. I do not want to see international cooperation only happening when it's got to do with checks and points. And I think that's a major issue that we can also lobby for, I think, alongside all the work we're doing in this field and all the things we want to do today.
Thank you.
Can I just point out, expecting, that will never happen, right? Expecting a government in Britain, the states do not exist to perpetuate the interests of the average people. That's not why the systems, I think that's also a key point that we've just been raising about why the police were constructed as they are. The solution is not from the top down, the solution is from the bottom up, which means speaking to people who you push against doors which are already willing to be pushed against. You don't go against the people who have a completely different worldview from you and aren't aware of the police deaths in custody and don't know what structural racism is. You deal with the low-hanging fruit first, and then you build momentum, you go from there.
Well, I've got two questions over here. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I have a question about the last 40 years that you put into the focus, even on the cover of your book. because I find it quite curious to see this intensification at the moment, but at the same time you're telling us a story from colonialism 150 and 200 years ago. What was in between? I appreciate the arguments about Mountbatten or Nixon and whatnot, but is there a time before the neoliberal wave that was in some ways better? Because it would sound a bit counterintuitive to me, especially when putting topics like mental health in the focus.
Great. So, yes, part of the basis for this periodicity, if you will, and I think it's defensible, is that for about 100 years, however horrible it was, our criminal justice system had a much more limited impact on people. Incarceration rates in the United States remained steady for about 100 years. Now, the people who were in it were badly mistreated, convict leasing. I lecture about plantation prisons, and it was horrible. But we went from 200,000 people a year in prison to 2.2 million. That is not a minor change. That is a landslide change. It's a quantum change, right? The quantity of the change was so great, it's fundamentally, qualitatively changed the nature of the equation. And that is a process of the last 40 years, and it is tied to these restructurings. And the expansion of policing is at the center. It's not the only expression, it's not the driver in some simplistic way. But part of my interest in doing this book is that we have this carceral studies discourse that's become much more robust, and it's just an amazing work that's been done. And there's all this discussion about the punitive turn, which is this 40-year period. And I felt like policing was basically being ignored. There's almost no discussion of it in Michelle Alexander's book and in Marie Gottschalk's book. It's very, there's a lot of work out there, and they were not talking about the role of policing because the impact of the criminal justice system is not limited to incarceration. Just talk to the young man who gets stopped and searched 6 times a year, or every goddamn time they leave their house, right? So we need to broaden our understanding of the impacts of the criminal justice system, and I do think there's something to be said about this 40-year expansion, but I think I've made very clear that if we get rid of that, that doesn't mean everything is rosy and perfect. There's still and it may just, we don't want a situation where we replace neoliberalism with some new system of exploitation that just produces its own forms of policing.
Essentially around the fact that it's more than policing, as you alluded to, it's the criminal justice system, and it's not just the people working in the criminal justice system, but the people who work around it. I wonder whether some of the people who could be the greatest advocates for this kind of change are going to be a bit locked in or difficult to convince of it because, and I include myself in this, they're essentially making a living out of alleviating the worst excesses of the criminal justice system, and if you get rid of the criminal justice system, there's no job for you in alleviating its worst excesses. And then the second one is a question, which is whether you thought at all about the coming sort of fourth industrial revolution and automation and AI and what that will do to sort of working class and what the police's role might be in policing that massive social change that's coming that will hollow out, I guess, the working class. And I wonder whether that touches on the issue of why the left has an issue, because policing is actually probably one of the last bastions of a working class career where you can start off working class and become a chief constable and earn £100,000 plus, so maybe the left feels connected to it.
Yeah, you don't even have to be a chief constable, you just need some overtime and well, that's a great segue to the previous answer, right? We have to be mindful that policing is a response to regimes of accumulation and exploitation, and as those regimes change, then policing changes to manage the consequences and the resistance to those changes. I mean, I think automation is just a continuation of the moment that we have. I mentioned before about convict leasing and plantation prisons. That was a period where there was a scarcity of labor for agricultural production, and so they used force to get people to work for free or worked people to death, et cetera, because they needed labor. Well, they don't need that labor anymore. The problem now is a problem of surplus labor. And how do you manage the large numbers of people who are basically alienated from formal work? Well, they move into black markets and they move into various antisocial behaviors, and then those get criminalized, and that's what the police spend their time doing, is managing those people who've been excluded from the increasingly precarious labor market. Now it's just going to get worse, right? Stanley Aronowitz says in his book, The Jobless Future. We have some glimpses, and
So is that an opportunity for change? Because it's so bad.
Oh, I don't want to go down that road. I think, I don't know. As to the earlier point, wouldn't people also be happy running community-based programs to actually help people in communities too? I mean, I know people who do that work. I think many of them would rather do that than fight bureaucracies that they don't agree with, or develop programs that don't always work and that they see the limitations of. And frankly, a lot of people working in the direct criminal justice system hate what they do. I wrote this piece about the closing of Rikers Island, and I'm a unionist, for people who don't know that. I'm a vice president of a large academic union. We represent 26,000 faculty and professional staff at the City University of New York. I wrote a piece and I said, look, the correction unions, their big response to the plan to close down Rikers Island, the city's main jail, is to instead build a new high-tech maximum security jail complex on the island, and that's their reform effort. And I said they should use their political power instead to guarantee adequate job transfers for their members, who enjoy a very high standard of living and are mostly people of color. And I pointed out that every corrections officer that I've ever known hated their job. The working conditions are awful. There's violence. The place is falling apart. The union itself consistently sues the city over the working conditions. So, yeah, we need to shift people in, and most of the guards would be much happier working in a library in their community. They'd have a shorter commute, they'd have positive interactions with kids, and if they could get the same pay and benefits, they would much prefer to do that.
Hi, thank you. I'm Evelyn Lewis, and I'm investigating the spying on political groups. You might be aware that there is an official inquiry into infiltration of political campaigns over the last 50 years.
Chapter 10 of the book.
I wanted to talk to you about that. You do, yeah. So you do describe how the police deals with protest, the entire spectrum of right policing, crowd control, and also infiltration. I was rather surprised to see that you then, at a certain point, write that the police should be allowed to gather intelligence if there is a threat to criminal offences, because that kind of turns your own argument on its head in a way. And I wanted to emphasise that from what we know, because most is being kept secret in this inquiry, but it's always an argument being used that we need to spy on political groups because we have to know who might go and commit a criminal offence, and it's being used as an excuse and as a way in, and it produces sort of the sliding scale. So I was really surprised to see you making that one.
This was really one of the most challenging chapters to write the later parts of, and I still do struggle with it. So I appreciate your feedback on that. So what do? We have a problem in the United States, as you do here, of
right-wing racist violence. So how are we going to manage that? Now, we could try to mobilize some community defense type work, and I'm all for that. But there may be a role for the state to play in managing some of the worst abuses that threaten us. So how the hell do we do that? It troubles me, right? Because we know that the risks of any empowerment of policing along these lines are huge. So I tried to talk about limiting, whittling down, trying to figure out what was left. And it was very hard to figure out where to kind of draw the line, because you do need some way to respond. So I believe, what I say is basically, most of these investigations are undertaken with no evidence of actual criminality and no independent oversight. So I say something along the lines, at the very least, there should be outside monitoring of any of these investigations, and there should be a clear evidence that there is at least some kind of criminal wrongdoing involved. It's not a perfect solution because there will be abuse of that. But I think the two things together would be a massive improvement over what we have now. Is it a non-reform reform? Possibly. I'd love to see, very little is being written about this. We need more ideas about how to do this. I've tried to follow the pushback against the whitewashing that the inquiry has turned into. And I'm well aware of the nature of the abuses as I lay out in the chapter, but I think we need more thinking on this, and I tried to cast about. And so, yeah, let's keep talking about it.
I've got a question there.
Can I ask two questions? You can deal with
Maybe.
Well, I'll ask two questions, and you can decide.
That's correct, yeah.
First, I was really interested in what's been said around the data that there is and the research to show that policing in its current form doesn't work. But what is the solution to that? So with the mental health problem as an example, there's a person with mental health problems and they've got weapons. If it isn't the police that deal with that, then who does deal with that? And where is the empirical data, the research, to show what the alternative is? Because it seems that all the work is being done to show how the current system doesn't work, but there is no data to show what the alternatives are. So that's the first, if you don't mind addressing that. And the second is it possible that actually the issue is broader than any of the institutions or society bodies which exist, and actually it's our political system in a democratic state that causes the problem? Now the danger with that is we end up with China, a Russian, we end up with a Tsar or a system, but our 4 or 5 year political system, which means I've got really a year of settling in where everyone's happy, 3 years of trying to keep my head above water, and then there's another political agenda, and we're never going to deal with these problems unless there can be a long-term solution discussed.
Okay, so I'll take the mental health one first. So many of the crises that involve weapons and become severe, and that oh yes, of course we must have a police. If we had any kind of adequate mental health infrastructure, we wouldn't get to this crisis mode. We know a lot
about how to provide sustained mental health treatment to people experiencing trauma, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, etc. But it's expensive and labor intensive, and we don't do it. What we do is the police bring someone into the A&E, you call it, right? And we call it an emergency room, and they're held for up to 72 hours for evaluation and stabilization, and then they're given a jar of pills and maybe an appointment for some future date, and they're sent back out into the street. So yeah, that doesn't work. But we do have research that shows how to manage someone who, let's say, has schizophrenia and needs medication to live independently. They need stable housing, access to their medication, and they need support, because these medications are not a cure-all. Dosage levels need to be adjusted. People get side effects. They stop taking the medication because of if there's no ongoing involvement with them, they destabilize, they lose their housing, and then they become homeless, mentally ill, and antisocial behavior for the rest of us. So I don't think there's a problem in knowing what to do. There's just absolutely no political will to do it.
But even with that approach, we're still going to have the scenario where someone has slipped through the net, where there's a problem.
Okay, so first of all, professional mental health workers deal with people who are having crises in clinical settings all the time, and they almost never kill anybody. There are tools that they can use to manage violent people even. This is,
But the mental health workers in the UK are calling the police to report assaults in mental health.
Yes, I know that. I know, and it's resulted in some deaths. So the problem is that we have to develop an infrastructure that is capable of managing these things. And it's not that we don't know how, it's that we don't do it. So yes, a mental health worker who's been trained to do counseling sessions or to hand out pills, or something, they're not trained in managing difficult people. That's a special kind of training that needs to be put in place. How to restrain someone. People who work in group homes and other kinds of clinical settings, often some of them get this training. We know how to do this training. But yes, if the person doesn't have that training, then they end up calling the police, and the police use their methods, which sometimes, usually actually comes out okay. It's a very small number of cases that turn so tragic, but it's not like we don't know what we would need to do to build such an infrastructure. I think the literature is pretty robust on this. As to the larger political questions, it's a little difficult to get into the weeds on that. I mean, do we need, this? I've always waited for a bit more criticism that the book isn't sufficiently anti-capitalist or something like that. I try to be empirical about these things. Can we work it out within the confines of a liberal democracy? Maybe. If we can't, then part of what we have to do is figure out what kind of a system would be capable of doing this.
I've got 3 or 4 questions. I just need to respond to something that you asked. People die, and I'm using the UK context here, and particularly some recent deaths you mentioned, a couple. People don't die because they've got mental health problems. They're dying because they are unlawfully and excessively restrained. The examples you gave where the police were called in, that was because there was negligence by hospital managers in ensuring that their staff were properly trained. And I completely concur with what you say, is that actually there are people working in mental health who are used to working with highly volatile, unwell people, and the key issue is not to put hands on, it's about de-escalation, it's about stepping back, and the police's response is it's to restrain, to take somebody down first. And I think that it's about that difficult, it is about what we're talking about here, about a punitive, coercive approach by police. So I just needed just to say that. I've got
Thank you.
1, 2, 3 contributions, 4 now, and we've got kind of 5 minutes. So can you make
No.
because
All right.
we've got to be out here by 9. You want to write? Do people want to buy your book?
Well, we can do that out in the hall or
But we
something.
have to
Yeah.
go out the bell. Anyway, so you're first. If you can keep them kind of relatively short.
Okay, great, Alex, you're doing this whistle talk tour, and the book really tries to reframe the debate. And I suppose I want to go back to something you said towards the end, that these ideas are beginning to have a bit of traction, and you mentioned your Ferguson visit, and also to go back to the answer that you gave here, that when you try to imagine what a stripped-down police might look like, it's an empirical project. And I really just wanted to ask, are there examples of community-led processes that a non-coercive vision of the police has emerged from, whether it's in relation to homelessness or drugs or protest policing, but that which we, will help us glimpse that whole new world of policing that...
I don't think there's any such thing as non-coercive policing. If it's non-coercive, it's not policing. To me, that's by definition. I think that's part of the problem here, is that we're trying to imagine friendly police. That's an oxymoron. When we tell the police to wage a war on crime, a war on drugs, a war on gang, a war on... they're not going to be friendly. They can't be friendly. Their job is to put hands on people. That is why we have police. And there may be situations where that's necessary. So, so it's not about that. Just give me the first part again, though.
So I'm just wondering, are there community-led...
Okay, sorry. So it's a little bit of jet lag, a lot of travel, sorry, so bear with me. Yes, the short answer is that, but they're not about making police different, they're about implementing some of these positive alternatives. So I won't belabor it, but we've got this thing like the Ithaca Plan in Ithaca, New York, to deal with their drug problems. And they came together as a community, had workshops, focus groups, town hall meetings, brought in harm reduction people, and they put all the resources that they could think of on the table, and they came up with a plan. And guess what? Police are not on the list. Harm reduction techniques, economic development programs, 24-hour drug crisis response teams, that's what will make their community safer and healthier. And so the mayor is backing it. They're working on trying to realize this plan. Minneapolis has a great blueprint for reducing youth violence that's based in the health department. The police have nothing to do with it. They're working with communities to try to get at the root of alienation, why kids feel insecure, why they pick up weapons as a tool of empowerment. It's not perfect. It's not a cure-all. They're not going, it's an example of a step in the right direction, and it doesn't come with all the collateral consequences of policing. David.
Is it possible to democratise the police, or is that asking the wrong question? And if it's asking the right question, what might it look like?
Yeah, so I struggle with that a little bit. I'm not in favor of community control of the police as we normally think about it. Because to me, that's going to give us gated communities and more bias in policing, and it also misunderstands the nature of community-state interaction. Now, in Seattle, they have this elected community police commission, and some people I know and trust feel enthusiastic about it. I'm not so sure. I'm going to be out there in May, so ask me again in June. But it's at least worth looking into. They have held the line on some important things, but I still think the focus is too much on what the police do rather than empowering communities to produce public safety.
Okay, what was that?
I'm a psychiatrist, and it was really just making a similar clarification to what you made, that actually the skills that mental health professionals have is actually one of de-escalation, and actually when those skills were of restraint, actually that is what led to the deaths in service. And also just to sort of also acknowledge that there is this shift that when the hospitals get too full or there are not enough hospital beds, those same people end up in the prison service. So actually the deaths and the harm are sort of quite similar in that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're next.
My question was sort of comes up as that question, which was about community action and sort of what that looks like. And you sort of touched upon what that does look like, but I'm sort of failing to see how that ties into police abolition.
Yep.
That's what it's about. How does that get to police abolition?
So I did a radio interview in Madison, Wisconsin, and when I do these radio interviews, I try to touch base with local activists whenever possible so I can find out what campaigns are going on. So there's a group there that's been organizing young people because they have school police. School police mistreat the young people, mostly young people of color, and the school police are paid for out of the education budget. So they're mobilizing the young people to speak out at public hearings. They've produced videos, it's called Freedom Inc., that say, this is not making us safer, it's not making our schools better, it's putting money in the wrong thing. We need restorative justice programs, we need community resources in the schools, we need better instruction in the schools, and you're using the little money we have to put armed police in our schools to harass us. So sometimes that's what it looks like. The Youth Justice Coalition in Los Angeles identified $10 billion a year of spending by LA County on jails and police. And they said if we could just have 5% of that money, we could fund summer jobs for every young person in LA County who wants one, and have money left over for violence interruption programs, after-school resources. That's what this looks like.
Okay, does anybody else have a burning question before we close? Kevin, did you have your hand up or were you just waving at me?
No, I guess, well, I wasn't getting the last word. So.
Oh, I didn't think that was going to happen, so shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, I mean, really just to say thank you for everybody for coming. I mean, one of the things about practical solutions and trying to find them is that they are going to need some work. One of the things that we're looking to do is a project where there are lots of people, including myself, who was involved in a local monitoring projects, monitoring the police for 25 years, who've got all this knowledge and skills in their head, and we're desperate to pass it on. And so we're looking at trying to produce some form of toolkit, because every week I get calls from people around the country saying, how do we deal with this situation, the stop and search that people in our community are facing? And we want to be able to pass that on. That's something we're actually looking at trying to do at the moment. So it's one of the reasons why I said at the beginning that I really hope people are here to decide to support Netflix work in the long term, because it's that kind of practical response that we're looking at trying to develop. But really, other than that, I just want to say thank you to everybody. You'll have seen that we're filming. We will try and get as much of this as we can edit together online for those people who weren't able to make it, because many of you will know this event sold out very quickly. If we could have put it in the main hall, we probably would have filled that as well. So, and thank you very much to Deb and to Alex for what's been a really fascinating evening. Thank you.